Hey guys, what's up? Hope you guys are doing okay. As I always tell you, there is no good way, there is no great way of capturing a specific photo. A photo or an art image is basically your perception of what you think a beautiful art image is, right? With that being said, today I'm going to speak to you guys about exposure and how you achieve the desired exposure. So basically, when it comes to exposure and using DSLR cameras, there are three main things that you have to take into consideration. You have the aperture, you have a shutter, and then you have the ISO. And these three things, they form something you call the exposure triangle, right? This exposure triangle, it is very, very important. Once you master this, you can take any specific shot that you want. This is the key to taking a great shot, okay? So please stick around and listen to what I have to tell you today, okay? I'm a little bit scared right here. I saw some big things jumping in the water, so I'm gonna change my location and then we'll get into things. Cool? So the first thing I want to talk about is aperture, and basically aperture can be found on the exposure triangle. It is not in a specific order, but I'm just giving you them as I go along. So basically aperture, this is the feature that controls the amount of the photo that is in focus. It controls how wide your lens opens, and the wider the lens opens, it lets in much more light, right? The smaller it opens, minimal light goes through the lens touching the sensor. And this aperture, it is represented by F numbers. So basically you have ranging from f1.2 to like f18, f20, f22. And basically f1.2 opens the lens the biggest, right? And f22 opens a very, very small hole. So basically f22 gives a little light to the sensor, and f1.2 gives a lot of light on the sensor, right? Also, if you're shooting at f1.2, a little bit of the image will be in focus. Basically, the depth of field is going to be very, very thin or very, very narrow. As opposing shooting like f22, the depth of field is extremely big and all of your image will be in focus. So that's what the aperture does. Guys, so the second thing that we have is shutter speed, and as I told you, all of these three elements controls the amount of light that lets in on the sensor, right? So the shutter speed, this tells you how fast the shutter opens and closes before the image takes, or for the image to be taken, right? So the shutter speed, it is represented by seconds, and sometimes you'll see 1 second, 1/10 of a second, 1/1000th of a second, 1/4000th of a second. And the higher the shutter speed is, so for example 1/4000th of a second will be much faster than 1 second, right? And basically, if you're taking photos and you don't want it to have that motion blur, it's best to shoot at a higher shutter speed. Normally for me, I shoot somewhere above 1/200th of a second if I'm taking like a portrait or something like that. If I am shooting like cars moving very fast, I try to go up to maybe 1/1000th of a second, and that will be perfect for me, right? So the shutter speed, as I was saying, it controls motion blur, and also it controls the amount of light that is let in on your sensor. For example, if you're doing landscapes and stuff like that, normally if you want to see that nice motion blur of a cloud, then you'll go down to maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds, depending on the lighting condition and stuff like that. So that's basically for your shutter speed. So the final thing on the exposure triangle is the ISO. Basically, the ISO, it is a technology on your sensor which records the amount of light your sensor produces. This normally is measured between numbers from like 100 to approximately 50,000. However, in some cases it is less than 100, and in some cases it is more than 50,000. The tricky thing about ISO, right? The higher you go with the ISO, you'll get much more light. However, you'll lose detail. Your images will get grainy. The good thing about it, like in this modern time, these DSLRs, you can go up to maybe 6,000-7,000 ISO and your image is not grainy, or it's grainy but it is actually usable. In older DSLRs, that wasn't the case. And that's it for ISO. So basically guys, it is pretty much easy to understand the aperture triangle. All you need to do is practice. Alright guys, to conclude on exposure, the good thing about it is that DSLR manufacturers or mirrorless camera manufacturers, they have a system which you can shoot in not only full auto mode, but you can shoot in maybe aperture priority mode, and this is where you can just set your aperture and it will allow you to select the depth of field that you want, or how you want your image to look in terms of depth of field, and the camera will automatically calculate the ISO and the shutter. Also, you can select shutter priority mode where you select the shutter speed that you want, and then the camera will calculate the aperture and the ISO. Or you can go in manual mode, right, with auto ISO. Once you select your shutter and your aperture, the camera will automatically calculate your ISO to level the exposure, right? And the next thing you can do, which I do normally and every day, I shoot in full manual. So what I normally do is I set my ISO first, right? Then I think about the shutter that I want to use depending on the situation. Once I select that shutter speed, then I go ahead and set my aperture. However, sometimes I'm doing like a portrait and I want the background to be super blurry. I select my ISO first again, then I select my aperture to maybe 1.8 or maybe 2.2 thereabout, and then I select my shutter speed to compensate for that. And how I know my exposure is perfect, right? While I'm looking through the viewfinder or I'm looking on the LCD at the back, there is a exposure meter, and once it is centered, it tells you that you're just about at the right exposure. So you could definitely use that, okay? Alright guys, thank you for watching. I really enjoyed teaching you guys about exposure and how I do my exposure. So if you like this video, just go ahead and give me a like. Please go ahead and subscribe to my channel, and you can share it with a friend also. And thank you guys again for watching. Peace.